Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Women in Leadership Talk podcast. Today, I have a very special guest. I have Kim Meninger joining us. And Kim has a fantastic background that I think you're going to really enjoy getting to hear some interesting topics. And our focus today is, really about what are some of the challenges that women are facing in our world today, but also how we start to look at systems that are in place and the environments that we're sitting in, and how we learn to navigate those. So I'm really excited to have Kim on the show today, just sharing her insight and expertise, given her background and the experiences that she's had. So Kim, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Vicki. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thrilled to have you, and we're thrilled to have our audience. We know you have a choice as to what podcast you listen to, and we're thrilled to know that in 44 different countries, you are listening to Women in Leadership Talk. So thank you for that. Thank you for your support. So let me give you just a little bit of context on Kim before we jump right in. She is a leadership coach and focused on empowering professionals and organizations that help them reach those new heights by making it easier to be human at work. And I love that, Kim, because I think so often we get away from that human element and we like to pretend for some reason that we're not human. So it was really important for me to share your bio, because I think that in itself will give our audience a clue as to how this conversation will take place today. And you've got such a great background. You've got your degree in psychology. You've got your MBA from Boston College. And your focus is really about spending time with people, helping them overcome imposter syndrome and helping them have more confidence, visibility, and influence. So audience, we've got a great speaker here today. Kim does a lot of keynote speaking, and really just helping to lead those discussions on being human. So Kim, thank you again for being here. Thrilled to have you. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about what your background is, where you came from the high tech industry, and how you moved into the coaching industry.
Sure. So thank you so much for the kind words. I stumbled into high tech many years ago. I always thought I wanted to be a therapist. That was just not something I ever questioned growing up. And then I decided not to go into a PhD program for psychology. It was the peak of the dot-com boom. So I found a job in the high tech space and I got kind of swept away by it. And there were some really great moments during my time there. And there were also some eye-opening moments for me, because I always bring a psychology lens to everything that I do. And it just became very clear to me that there were a lot of people struggling and that there wasn't a lot of support. And so there were sort of expectations that people managers just intuitively knew how to manage. There were lots of stressful moments that weren't necessarily acknowledged as such. And so I, on the one hand, had myself fully in the arena with people. On the other hand, I felt like there was this out-of-body experience at times where I was watching from a distance and noticing trends and patterns, particularly as I was getting my MBA while working full-time. I was really concentrating on leadership and just noticing things, connecting dots that just felt to me like there's a better way to do this, and we're not having that conversation. And so I made the decision when I was pregnant with my older son, who's now 13, to go on maternity leave and never return. And it was during that time that I found coaching and started doing the work that I do today. And I very sincerely say that I strive to be the resource to women that I wish I had during that time. And I'm hoping that by bringing my experience and, my perspectives to other women in the community, that they will be able to have more confident, empowered experiences in their workplaces.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. And we need that. And I agree wholeheartedly with you, because I was the same. I wish I'd had somebody like me or like you to support me on that journey as, I navigated C-suite boardroom conversations, the stresses that you mentioned. And maybe let's just talk about that, because I think you highlighted a number of things, like maybe what are some of the challenges that you are seeing today with the clients you work with, but also some of the ones that you experience personally?
Sure. And so the ones that I talk about most often, actually, I was having a conversation about this with a group yesterday, are the double bind, right? This idea that women can be likable or competent, but rarely both because of gender stereotypes that create backlash when we show up in more agentic or self-advocating ways. And so what that does is it creates this profile of a leader as very masculine. And if we deviate from traditional female gender stereotypes of being warm and approachable and nurturing and caring, then we're seen maybe as competent, but not necessarily leadership material. If we show up in more traditionally feminine ways, we're seen as likable, but not leadership material, right? So we have this think leader, think male kind of unconscious bias that when we think about now imposter syndrome, which is another area that I spend a lot of time thinking about, we've bought into this narrative that there's one way to be a leader, that there's one right way of leading, right? And that if we don't follow that script or we don't fit into that box, that there's something wrong with us and that we don't deserve to be in the room, that we need to fix ourselves in some way. And so there's this chronic state of second guessing, of self-consciousness, of self-doubt that is running alongside our work. And so it's consuming a lot of energy that could otherwise be spent on higher value added activities, right? Like building relationships or being strategic in your role. But instead, we just have to feel at all times like we have to calibrate ourselves, right? Am I saying this too aggressively? Am I saying this too passively? How are other people going to perceive me when I show up? So that's at the backdrop for so many women, which just creates a lot of stress and anxiety.
Well, I was when you were just describing that, I'm like, put yourself in that position and you think about the level of stress that is on you constantly. And then you have to kind of switch that off when you get home, or you think you have to switch it off, right? So you are constantly playing this balance game, and that becomes very difficult, right? And then at home, even your spouse or your kids are like, "Mom, why are you being so difficult?" And that's not what your intent is. So, Kim, what are some ways that individuals, women in particular, how can they start to navigate that? Or what do you see as the possibilities of shifting that, the unconscious bias or the paradigms that are happening?
So I think in large part, it starts with understanding that that's what's happening, because what often happens, and, I talk a lot about the fact that our brains are wired to keep us alive. So we end up in fight or flight a lot throughout our days. And that looks different to each individual, but it might look like just sitting on the sidelines and not participating. It might mean being in our heads about what we did wrong and how to fix it. It oftentimes what will happen, I hear women say things to me like, I don't know what happens to me. It's like I show up in this meeting and I lose my ability to form a coherent thought. I can't articulate what I want to say. And I think to myself, this is a perfectly intelligent woman. She doesn't struggle with articulating what she wants to say in other settings. This is not a function of her capabilities. This is that her brain detected a threat when she walked into this room, and she's now in fight or flight and can't access the thoughts in the way that she otherwise would. So it's really important for us to understand what's going on, whether it's within our own biology or within the system around us, because how we interpret that has strong implications for how we address it. And if we think this is my problem to solve, there's something wrong with me, right? We're always going to be trying to fix ourselves, when in actuality, it's a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. And I want to caveat that by saying we can only control ourselves, right? So there's been a lot of talk about stop telling women they have imposter syndrome, and that imposter syndrome is a conspiracy to hold women back. I don't agree with that at all. I think that there are many women who struggle with this and deserve to be given tools and given support around it so that we can navigate while change occurs in the background at a very slow rate. But I think what's really important is that we understand this isn't about me. That, we control what we can control. But the more I understand that, the behaviors that I see in other people are about them and not about me,
Yeah.
more I can gain perspective and look at how do I empower myself.
Yeah. That's so important. Like on so many levels, right? Because when you can take that pause and recognize that you are responsible for you, right? And you have a choice as to how you see those things. It's not you. Like, you are capable, you're competent, but often it is the systems that we have created. And so let's talk a little bit about that. And by the way, this happens for men too. This is not just a female phenomenon. This happens to both genders. It's just that women, I think we internalize it a bit more than men often will, but it happens to both. So when we look at systems, how do we start to shift and change those systems? And I know you and I've talked about this, privately, even, like, the systems are in everything. It's in organizations, it's in education, it's in our government, it's in all aspects of the environments that we interact with on a daily basis. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so my thoughts have been evolving on this over time as I continue to observe and engage with people in different situations. And I think that a lot of the problem lies in our hustle culture, for lack of a better term. And you and I have talked about your own story on my podcast as well. And this constant pressure to be working all the time, or to at least be available on standby, right? So you're never fully unplugged or checked out of work. And so what that does is it creates very chronically high stress levels among everybody in the organization. And when we are stressed, we are not showing up as our best selves. We are not collaborative. We're not empathetic. We are not curious, right? We are all about self-preservation. And when you are in a system where it's every man for himself, every person for themselves, right? There is just a continuation of triggers and I can't even tell you how many people I know who've gone out on mental health leave because they've finally reached a point where they can't handle it anymore. So I think that aggravates a lot of the other system issues that we would normally talk about, like unconscious bias or, just structural challenges that have made it more difficult for women to advance within the organization. If you've got a lot of people at the top that are very stressed out, they're not mentoring, they're not supporting, they're not providing opportunity for other people. They're thinking about what's going to happen to me. So I think that one of the greatest opportunities we have available to us is to really think about how we take care of ourselves and to recognize where stress may be undermining our best selves. And again, we can't control everything and everyone, but the higher up you are in the organization, the more influence you do have to have that conversation. And even if it's within your own team, even if it's just being a little bit more empathetic and sensitive to the needs of your own team, you can create a sort of subculture within the larger culture that if you get it right, and you start to show results from that, people are going to start to say, what's she doing?
Exactly.
Something she's doing is working. I want to learn more about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. That ripple effect is so important. And it's not talking about, we need to be aware of X, Y, Z. It's actually walking it and living it on a daily basis. So you said a number of things there, I think, that are super important. So we're in this high, fight or flight. We're in this high reactionary space instead of being very thoughtful and responsive. And so that shift to what you shared, and I fully am supportive of this and believe in this, that it starts with us, right? We have to be the ones to slow that pace down enough to be able to say, well, hang on a second. Let's talk this through for a moment. Right. And I know sometimes we don't always have the patience to do that. And so it really does require discipline and muscle building to be able to slow that pace down enough to do that. So you've said a number of things I think that are super, super important. So if I'm in that high state of, anxiety or fight or flight, what would be one thing you think I could do to just make that subtle shift, or just even for a moment, slow it down enough to get a little bit of clarity and perspective?
Yeah, great question. So at an individual level, I usually recommend 3 very easy steps for getting control of this response. Number 1 is to take deep breaths. If you think about your brain overreacting and perceiving a threat within the environment, and that's what sets us off in this adrenaline rush, that taking deep breaths sends a very clear signal to your brain that it's a false alarm. Because if you were being chased by a tiger in the wilderness, you would not be able to stop and take a deep breath, right? So it's a way of, almost like our security systems within our homes, you put in the code, right, to say false alarm, don't send to the police, I'm fine, right? Taking a deep breath is the same effect on our brain. So it starts to slow you down. The second one is keep a drink with you at all times when you're in meetings, when you're in interactions with others, because it's a great pause button. If you start to feel your system getting activated, you can just take a sip, use it as a moment, collect yourself, take a breath. You don't have to immediately respond to whatever it is that just triggered you. And number 3 is speak slowly. Control the pace of your speech, because when we get really nervous or stressed, we tend to speak really quickly, and it perpetuates this sense that we're in danger. Whereas the mere act of controlling the pace of your speech involves the part of your brain that gets shut down when you're in fight or flight. So you can actually get back to more of a problem-solving, reason-based part of your brain when you do it that way. And you also come across as more in command. People treat you accordingly. It becomes sort of this virtuous cycle, right? So those are 3 simple things that I recommend people put on a sticky note and keep available to them, because you never know when something's going to come at you in a meeting. And just knowing that you have those steps available to you can go a long way in bringing you back to neutral.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I actually, there's a woman that I know that she is a coach, but she works with people who are doing TED Talks or pitches, like on Dragon's Den or Shark Tank. And she talks about what you just described, actually, with the speaking slowly, and she links it with breath. And so she, her thing is, you breathe from the belly, because it forces you to speak slowly when you start. And that is a really powerful, even if you have to get up and, let's say you're presenting to, the executive team or the board of directors, or even your own team. Maybe you've just been hired or promoted and you're talking to your own team, but really doing that belly breath, because it does force you to slow down how quickly you're speaking.
Absolutely.
And I'm a fast talker. Right? So it's like, okay, Vicki, you need to practice this yourself.
Exactly. And sometimes when you're used to speaking really quickly, it might sound like you're, in slow motion, but it doesn't sound that way to other people.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well said. So the other thing you talked about was like being responsive. I'd like us to spend just a few minutes talking about that, because I think you and I are very much in sync on, how to present yourself when you're responding. You have that ability to really shift energy that's happening in the room. And unfortunately, when you talked about that hustle culture, we are knee-jerk reacting all the time, right? It's like, we got to get something out, because if we don't speak up, they're going to think we're not competent, or, oh, Vicki doesn't contribute in meetings. So how do we ensure that we have that presence so that people don't think we're just, stalling, or that we're not contributing?
Yes. So as much as possible, I recommend being proactive, because we can't be trusted to access these kinds of thoughts in the moment of fight or flight for the reasons we talked about. Our brains are not in that space. So I recommend a couple of things. Number 1 is really knowing, and this might sound a little bit cheesy, but it really works, is knowing who you want to be. How do you want to be experienced by the people around you? What do you stand for? What are your core values? And doing that in a neutral moment where you're not under stress, you're not rushed. You can do this incrementally. You don't have to do it all in one sitting, but just how do I want other people? What do I want them to say about me when I'm not in the room? Right? Things like that. And so what does that tell me about the kind of presence I want to have in certain situations? So, I stand for ensuring that there's inclusion in these conversations. So what would that look like behaviorally once I get into the room? I want to make sure that we're mindful of risks that may come up. So what does that look like when I get into the room? And then when you have that, and you've gone through that exercise, it becomes somewhat of a roadmap for you when you are in uncertain moments. So if you've thought about this, you've read it before you stepped into the room, you kind of keep it visually available. Then when you find yourself at a crossroads, do I go down this path that's more of a reactive path, or do I go down a path that's in alignment with who I want to be? You can ask yourself, which of these options will allow me to be as true as possible to the person that I want to be? And we're not always going to take that path. There are going to be times when we're too stressed out, or there's not enough psychological safety, or some other reason we don't, but we're much more likely to do it if we've planned for it and we've thought about it. And related to that is to just really, like you said, everything's knee jerk, everything's reactionary. If instead, I take 2 minutes before I go into a meeting, I look at the agenda and I ask myself, what do I want to contribute here? Where do I have value to offer? Because so often our brains go to, what does everyone else know that I don't know?
Yes, 100%.
What are all the smart people around me going to say that I'm not going to understand or not going to be able to compete with? Instead, look at the agenda and say, where's my expertise?
Yes.
Where's my point of view here? What do I uniquely have to offer? And then bring that with you into the conversation again, so that it won't always go according to plan, but at least you've come with some sense of how you want to participate.
Yeah, love that. Oh my gosh, I think that's brilliant. And so important, right? Because every individual has something to contribute. And we get in our own head saying, oh, I'm not smart enough, or I'm not, pretty enough, or whatever the enough story might be. And that is just simply, it's a lie. It's false. Right? Because your perspective is unique and different from anybody else's. And guaranteed somebody else in the room is saying or thinking, I wish I had contributed that. So just say it, just do it. There's no harm, no foul for bringing it up.
Yes.
I think that's awesome. Yeah. And the other thing as you were speaking, Kim, that sort of tweaked me is, and I love what you said about being proactive, right? So how do you want others to experience you? What are the behaviors? What's the impact you want to have? I think another thing that would be really important as we step into meetings is think about who might trigger you, right? From a proactive perspective. So if I know, Kim speaks over me, or she says things that typically get my, the hair on the back of my neck standing up, how energetically am I going to be in a space that I don't let that affect me in that way?
That's right.
And I think that's a big one. And I can think of examples in my own career, right? I remember we had this one CFO in one of the jobs that I had, and he just knew how to get under my skin. And every time I would leave that meeting regretting either what I hadn't said or what I did say. and I wish back then I had somebody, like you or like me, having those conversations and that support, because he wasn't a bad guy. He just had his own method of delivery, and it didn't work with my style. And we did find common ground eventually, but I think that's really important to recognize.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. And there's a few thoughts related to that. Is number one is, how do you manage your own response to it? Like you said, don't let it get to you. This isn't about you. This is about them. So you maintain your own cool as much as possible. But there's also you don't have to go it alone. If there's somebody more senior in that room with you that you trust and can ask for support, this person tends to interrupt me. Would you be willing to push back on them on my behalf? Right? You can leverage your allies as well. And even having a side conversation with the person that you know is going to behave that way to get your story in sync before you get in the room. So let's do a dry run together so that we are not stepping over each other when we get into this room. And obviously different possibilities will exist depending on the power differential and the different circumstances, but there are options available for how to manage these kinds of personal triggers.
Yeah, I think that's a big one. And, you know, I find it interesting, especially when we think about from a gender perspective, because often, you know, women will take it personally, and we don't need to, where men just fluff it off, right? And they can sit and argue and fight it out in the you know, meeting room, and then walk out and, you know, hey buddy, let's go have a beer together. And so it's being able to recognize it for what it is, to your point. And I think that's such an important comment. And it's also important to have the support, right? Like, you know, the allyship you just talked about, mentorship, you know, somebody who is able to mentor you, who maybe have experienced something similar. And you know what, I'm going to promote coaching because you and I both are coaches. I think it's, you know, it's used to, coaching was looked at as if you have a problem, right? If you're underperforming. That is not what we're here for. We're here to help people navigate some of these issues so that you can excel. So I think that's also a really important message.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think having a safe space to practice and work through some of these things and then take that back to your actual meeting, it can be really confidence inducing too.
100%. So Kim, what have we not talked about that we should talk about?
Oh, that's a really good question. Well, so I think about all of these themes that we're talking about as sort of a tangled web, right? Because it's very hard to address them in a vacuum. There's so many different elements that are overlapping. And so we talked about the fact that what can we do to stay in control? We can only control ourselves. We can have influence, especially the more power we have, or, you know, our position within the workplace. But I also think it's important to recognize when it's time to say, this just isn't working for me. Yeah. And so we can do the best we can to create the kind of subculture that we talked about, of be the change you want to see, manage your own stress, take care of yourself, set those boundaries that are going to help you to stay in your best condition. But if you're finding that it's always an uphill battle, that it is always out of alignment with who you want to be and the values that you hold, that doesn't mean you failed. It just means that this is not the right environment for you, and that you can bring all of your amazing skills and talents to someone else who will respect and appreciate them. So I think sometimes as women, we feel a sense of obligation to other people. We feel like we should just be grateful to have a job. Sometimes when we're earlier in our careers, we don't even know what we don't know. So it just feels like, oh, this is just the way the workplace works. But you know in your gut whether something is right for you or not. And so if you've done what's within your control to do and it is still not working, to look at leaving not as a failure, but as a success, as an empowered choice.
Love that. Wow. Great. That's a great way for us to wrap up our conversation today. And so empowering. So thank you for that. So I know you have your podcast, and I know you have a forum that you do that people can drop into. So maybe just talk about that a little bit and how people can find you.
Sure. Thank you for asking. So the forum is every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. It's just a place to have this conversation in a more intimate way of what's making it hard for us to be our best selves at work. It used to be exclusive to women, but I've decided to open it up. We all have to work together. Let's talk about these things together. It's a really dynamic, really, kind of fun, but also important conversation. So that is available on my website, kimmeninger.com. And the podcast too. You and I have talked on my podcast as well, the Impostor Syndrome Files, for anybody who wants additional support navigating imposter syndrome and self-doubt in the workplace.
Awesome. Awesome. So you heard it right there, KimMeninger.com. So you can reach out to Kim. And if you have questions of either one of us, feel free. You can reach out to me directly. You can reach out to Kim directly. We're here. Both of us are here to support you in your journey of growth and helping you to be the best that you can be. So Kim, thank you. This has been a great conversation. It went by really fast. Thank you for spending time with us this morning. And I want to thank our audience. Thank you so much for joining us today. And again, if you have questions about your own leadership, please feel free to go on to WIL, that's 1L, and take our free leadership quiz. And that'll give you some insight as to how you're showing up as a leader. So thank you, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you on the next Women in Leadership Talk podcast. Have a great day.